You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is Wednesday, November 19th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest work is a new edition of his book entitled Blows Against the Empire, U.S. Imperialism in Crisis, which is available for pre-order on the International Publisher's website. Blows Against the Empire was originally published in 2008. This new edition of Blows Against the Empire includes a new introduction by Dr. Horne updating this classic text. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. And check out the Around the Horne Substack, entitled Notes from Around the Horne, which is a weekly list of some of the articles reviewed by Dr. Horne in preparation for each week's show. The link can be found in the description of this show. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Horne, as we go around the horn, first I want to ask you about the docuseries entitled The American Revolution, directed by Ken Burns and Sarah Botstein. The series is a 6-part, 12-hour documentary, which premiered on PBS this past Sunday, November 16th, 2025. Dr. Horne, while we have not yet watched the series, we wanted to get your assessment and reaction to the docuseries on 1776, and also want to ask how the airing of this series at this juncture in history reflects any trends you see domestically within the U.S.?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that the series is overwhelmingly anti-historical. What I mean by that is, one reason to study history is to gain insight into the present. But this documentary series steers clear of the present because that would bring it into confrontation with Trumpism, and the Trumpistas have already moved to cut off funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which has been a major source of financing for this series. But by steering away from the present, ultimately it misleads a good deal of its audience. For example, if 1776 was so grand, how did we end up with Trumpism in the first place? And why is it that in the current edition of the British publication, The Economist, do we have a lengthy story written by Harvard law professor Jack Goldsmith and former Obama lawyer Bob Bauer, sketching a credible scenario for 2026 November, whereby after an apparent loss by the GOP, they will impound the ballot boxes, for example, perhaps declare martial law. And if 1776 was so grand, how did we end up with such danger and such peril? How did we end up with January 6, 2021, when Mr. Trump sought to execute yet another coup d'etat? How to explain Andrew Jackson, Mr. Trump's favorite president, who in the 1820s executed the so-called Trail of Tears, a massive example of ethnic cleansing, when the indigenous population of the southeast quadrant of North America were expelled unceremoniously and marched across the continent to what is now Oklahoma, then called Indian Territory, which was supposed to be a kind of Bantustan, until the settlers decided that they wanted that land too. How to explain Roger Taney, the Chief Justice in the 1850s, who was responsible for the infamous and notorious Dred Scott decision, who suggested that Black people could not be citizens of the United States of America. And so there's this yawning and enormous gap between the hero making of this 1776 documentary and the ugliness that followed 1776. It's almost as if there's no connection between the two. And like most liberals, these documentary filmmakers create a mythology in the sense that 1776 in the first instance was about 13 colonies strung alongst the Atlantic seaboard. roughly from Boston to Savannah. But how did the United States of America today arrive at a point where it stretches not only from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but out into the Pacific, snatching Hawaii in the 1890s and then incorporating it as a state in 1959? That is to say, history is submitted to a massive disservice in this so-called historical series. Now, of course, if you squint and subject this series to strict scrutiny, you can come away with certain prevailing inferences. For example, African Americans were the group most likely to vote against Trump in 2020 and 2024, and they were the group most likely to oppose George Washington in 1776. But of course, the liberals have to rely very heavily upon the Black vote and Black support because there's an implicit awareness that the settler descendants usually steer to the right and they cannot be relied upon. But in order to corral this Black vote, basically you have to throw dust in the eyes of the Black audience, which is what this series does. Still, it's important to add that despite its weaknesses, this documentary series is more ideologically advanced and politically advanced than most of our so-called radical and revolutionary analyses, because at least this series hints that a revolt led by enslavers might have had something to do with slavery, might have had something to do with the growing abolitionist movement in London, and that a revolt that was energized by the desire to seize the land of the indigenous may have had something to do with London in 1762, 1763, marking the so-called proclamation line, whereby they had forbidden land grabbers like George Washington from steering beyond this line in order to grab Native American land. And overthrowing the proclamation line was the central reason for 1776, which is one of the reasons why shortly after 1776 and the proclamation of the Constitution, these 13 colonies already had begun to expand. However, our friends on the left, oftentimes, they see it as heretical to raise the question of slavery and indigenous dispossession in explaining the revolt, which is rather curious because supposedly they're materialists. They're looking for material reasons for causation and for reality. But instead of grasping and groping for material factors, they're left with empty and vaporous terms like liberty and taxation without representation. And even if you're going to raise taxation without representation, you can put that in the context of slavery, because it's fair to infer that settlers who are accustomed to free labor do not want to be taxed for services. They're too accustomed to having things done for free on their behalf. A few weeks ago, I raised the question of the newly published book by the apologist for 1776, Joseph Ellis, the book entitled The Great Contradiction being what I just talked about. How could these men who supposedly walked on water continue as enslavers and continue grabbing Native American land? Once again, what this suggests is that some of the liberals are to the left of those who style themselves as revolutionary. That is to say, if you're going to do a materialist analysis of 1776, you should start in the first instance with slavery and indigenous dispossession, and then move on to the adjacent issues of settler colonialism and class collaboration, particularly amongst settler descendants in the working class, which continues to bedevil us, which is what we pointed out in analyzing the New York City mayor's race just a few days ago. Perhaps the only thing that's shocking in the final analysis about this Ken Burns-Botstein documentary series is that there haven't been more protests. I expected protests at PBS affiliates, KQED in San Francisco, WETA in Washington, D.C., WNET in New York City. But alas, those protests have not materialized yet.
Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about several issues related to Latin America. First, regarding Venezuela, it was reported on November 11th that the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, reached waters off the coast of Venezuela, increasing the specter of a U.S. invasion of Venezuela. On the other hand, U.S. President Trump said this past Sunday, November 16th, that the United States may open talks with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Also this past Sunday, November 16th, voters in Ecuador headed to the polls for a series referendums proposed by President Daniel Noboa, and voters rejected all four President Noboa's referendums. The voters handedly issued Noboa a decisive defeat, particularly as it relates to Noboa's plan to open the country up to foreign U.S. military bases, as well as rejecting Noboa's attempt to rewrite the Constitution, end public funding for political parties, and reduce the number of lawmakers in the National Assembly to consolidate his power. Also in Chile, on Sunday, the first round of Chile's presidential election has left Communist Janet Jara and right-winger Jose Antonio Cast as the top two finishers, meaning that they will meet in a runoff on December 14th. And this past Monday 17th, President Trump implied that he would consider bombing Mexico in an attempt to target alleged drug traffickers. There also appears to be a color revolution brewing in Mexico. There are also stories out of Colombia and COP30 in Brazil. But let's pass the mic back to you, Dr. Horne. What should we be paying attention to in Latin America right now?
Well, certainly Venezuela is on the front lines right now. The New York Times reported today that a covert action is underway in Caracas designed to dislodge Mr. Maduro from power. But this may be part of disinformation. This may be part of the art of the bluff, which I think Mr. Trump is more attuned to nowadays instead of the art of the deal, particularly in light of the fact that his base has been heavily criticizing him because of his penchant and proclivity to get involved in the internal affairs of other nations. Witness the bombing of Iran just a few months ago in collaboration with Zionist Israel. And so he may be trying to engage in a massive head fake against the Venezuelans, but he may be in over his head, because keep in mind that Venezuela is no pushover. It's larger than Ukraine. It's larger than Texas. It has 30 million strong population. It has millions in a militia. It's festooned with jungles and desert. It's a very difficult terrain for an invader to operate on. It also enjoys the support of Cuban intelligence. It enjoys Russian arms and enjoys Chinese financing. It enjoys Iranian engineers who have been keeping the petroleum industry intact despite sabotage by US-backed forces. And that brings us to neighboring Colombia, which is obviously in the bad books of US imperialism. Recall that when President Petro was in New York a few weeks ago, he called upon US soldiers to disobey orders with regard to invading Venezuela. Recall that even the British, a usual lapdog for US imperialism, there have been stories in the press yet to be independently confirmed that Britain has cut off intelligence cooperation with the United States after these criminal bombings of fishermen in the Caribbean Sea. Not only that, but Colombia still contains armed formations who would be, I'm sure, elated to join in a righteous fight against invaders from north of the Caribbean Sea, meaning the United States of America. And as a final note on Colombia, I should mention that Colombia has been increasingly strident in its denunciation of Israel, along with South Africa as part of the so-called Hague Group, which has taken the vanguard role with regard to confronting the Zionist entity. With regard to Chile, there is a historical lesson there, because many of us recall what happened on September 11th, 1973, when a US-backed coup in Chile led to a fascist dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet, that lasted for decades, and the communist boogeyman was an ostensible reason for this coup. But yet, in this past Sunday's election, a communist got more votes than any other candidate, although we'll see what happens with regard to this runoff. And with regard to COP30, there also is a story there. I'm speaking of the forum taking place at the mouth of the Amazon River Valley, dealing with climate heating and overheating. COP30, in the final analysis, may be a kind of paradigm for where the planet is going. That is to say, it's being boycotted by US imperialism. But the good news is that that means that operations are going much more smoothly than they would if the obstructionists from Washington were present. You may get another glimpse of this tendency with the Group of 20 meeting unfolding shortly in South Africa, where once again, US imperialism is boycotting. But that also suggests that rules of the road can be established by the sane global majority that ultimately US imperialism will have to bow towards. And this latter story with regard to Mexico is quite troubling in light of the fact that the two most populous states in the United States of America, speaking of Texas and California, used to be part of northern Mexico before the ill-advised US invasion of that neighbor to the south in the mid-19th century. I think that also lurking not far from the surface with regard to this loose talk about bombing Mexico is nervous apprehension about Mexico's ever closer relationship to the People's Republic of China, particularly economically and financially, and what that may portend for US imperialism. And the opportunists of all opportunists, speaking of President Macron of France, was just in Mexico City a few days ago, supposedly bolstering the regime, but he's so two-faced that you never know. But certainly I would hope that at least his visit occupies attention in the State Department that otherwise could be allocated to drawing up war plans with the War Department across the river in Virginia.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about news out of South Africa. It was reported this past Sunday, November 16th, that the Umkhonto we Sizwe MKA party, led by former South African President Jacob Zuma, is experiencing significant internal turmoil, marked by factionalism, high turnover of key personnel, financial problems, and public clashes among its leadership. It was reported that Jacob Zuma's MK party is collapsing under its own chaos. Dr. Horne, what is your analysis and assessment of what is going on with the Jacob Zuma and the MK party?
First of all, it should be said to begin with that when the leadership of the African National Congress got involved in a palace coup that supplanted the previous leader, Thabo Mbeki, and replaced him with Jacob Zuma, that was one of the most disastrous, catastrophic personnel changes in the history of this small planet, perhaps even worse than supplanting left-leaning Henry Wallace as FDR's vice president in 1944 with the right-wing Harry S. Truman, who then went on to preside over the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not to mention launching the Red Scare and exacerbating the Cold War. It should have been easily foreseeable that Jacob Zuma, with his multiple wives and his numerous children, presented the ultimate recipe for corruption. And that is what proceeded. But it was worse than that, because recall what happened in 2001, when it seemed like Jacob Zuma was going to be held to account, 2021, I should say, when it seemed like Jacob Zuma was going to be held to account because of his mass violations of the law. He unleashed tribalism. He called his fellow Zulus into the streets of Durban, which was totally hostile and alien to the best traditions of the African National Congress and their South African Communist Party allies. And it also had more than a scintilla of anti-Asian, anti-Indian bigotry attached to it. So when we read these stories about Jacob Zuma traveling north to Morocco where he basically sells out the Polisario, the sole authentic, legitimate representative of the people of Western Sahara. Western Sahara, of course, once a Spanish colony, but then occupied by Morocco in the wake of the death of the Spanish dictator Franco. It was inevitable that he would go there with his begging bowl, since he is no more than a sink of corruption. But in all fairness, I should mention that Morocco has attained significant support in its campaign to retain phosphate-rich Western Sahara. And phosphates, of course, are necessary for fertilizer, necessary for agriculture. The People's Republic of China has been rather close to Morocco in recent months, if not recent years. But our audience should be aware of the fact that there's more than a hint of bad politics involved with this alliance between Zuma's MK party and the royal family in Rabat. What I mean is that historically, Morocco has been a source of anti-Blackness. In fact, as I pointed out in a number of books, it's Morocco that collaborated with London in terms of attacking African nations to the south, which contributed to the onrushing African slave trade. It was Morocco, which of course was involved heavily in the trans-Saharan slave trade, involving snatching and kidnapping African young men in particular. It's Morocco that as recently as the 1990s, you had segregated mosques in that North African country. And so Morocco, which also is a stalwart foe of neighboring Algeria, has been a human rights disaster, a political disaster. And to cap it all off, it brags about being the longest standing ally of the United States. Their Treaty of Friendship, believe it or not, was inked in the 1780s. And since that time, Morocco has been a reliable ally of this enslaving republic. And Mr. Zuma, of course, needs to be reprimanded and rebuked for going there. And I'm sure ultimately he'll face justice in the courts.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about news from yesterday, Tuesday, November 18th, that musical artist Nicki Minaj is working with the Trump administration to take a stand against what they describe as a Christian genocide in Nigeria. Yesterday, Nicki Minaj even gave a speech at the United Nations headquarters, calling out what she claimed as, quote, extremism against Christians in Nigeria, and said, quote, I would like to thank President Trump for prioritizing this issue and for his leadership on the global stage in calling for urgent action to defend Christians in Nigeria. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to this news? And like our first question about the Ken Burns cover-up, how does this news that Nicki Minaj carrying heavy water for Dr. Trump and that she is doing so against Nigeria and Nigerians?
Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that there is religious zealotry taking place in Nigeria, particularly by those who call themselves Muslim. But Christians are not the only victim of this religious zealotry. There is Muslim on Muslim violence, so-called. But in any case, I find it curious that Nicki Minaj would collaborate with the Trump regime on this sensitive question, since we know that in terms of this kind of religious zealotry, it oftentimes has manifested itself in violence against Christians. Washington, along with its ally in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, have been largely responsible for this phenomenon, going back to Afghanistan in the 1980s, or Bosnia, a former constituent republic in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. We also know, and I hope that Nicki Minaj has been briefed on this, that these religious zealots are in the process of trying to strangle and asphyxiate progressive regimes in the Sahel, neighbors of Nigeria, including Niger, Burkina Faso, and of course, Mali. We mentioned more than once the ongoing attempt to blockade Bamako, the capital of Mali, in order to bring down that regime. But perhaps more than that, Nicki Minaj violates the the heroic traditions of her compatriots in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm speaking of Henry Sylvester Williams, a pioneer in the Pan-Africanist movement, who actually at the turn of the 20th century made it all the way to Abyssinia, Ethiopia, in order to enlist that African nation in the Pan-Africanist cause. I'm thinking, of course, of Claudia Jones, who was a U.S. communist born in Trinidad and Tobago, ultimately deported from this country, where she wound up in London and began to lead struggles in the Black British community. I'm speaking of Eric Williams, the author of the iconic text, Capitalism and Slavery, which continues to repay attention. Of course, we're speaking of C.L.R. James and his really profound book on the Haitian Revolution, The Black Jacobins. This audience is more familiar than most with the man once known as Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, his contributions to the Black Power movement. And of course, there's Michael X, who was hung in Trinidad and Tobago in 1975. And so what concerns me more than this propaganda that she's spewing is that there will be knock-on effects in Trinidad and Tobago, where relations between those of African descent and those of South Asian descent, many of whom are Muslims, has been not necessarily ideal. You could say the same thing about Guyana, for example, the only predominantly English-speaking country in South America. And so it would not surprise me at all if Nicki Minaj has stumbled into a catastrophe that could harm her career, particularly a boycott of her music.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about news from yesterday, Tuesday, November 18th, about President Trump rolling out the red carpet to Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman MBS, who met with President Trump at the White House. Among the topics discussed between Trump and MBS were agreements on defense, intelligence sharing, AI, nuclear energy, and trade. The White House announced two major deal signings: an agreement in principle for the U.S. to help Saudi Arabia develop a civilian nuclear energy program, and a major defense sale package that includes the expected approval for the Saudis to purchase F-35s. The de facto Saudi ruler also promised to invest a cool $1 trillion in the U.S., upping the $600 billion commitment he made when Trump visited Saudi Arabia earlier this year. MBS also expressed his interest in joining Trump's Abraham Accords scheme, but reiterated that he would not normalize relations with Israel absent a, quote, clear path to a two-state solution. That is a massive concession to Israel, since the Arab position on normalization used to be Palestinian statehood, full stop, and now all he's demanding is a meaningless, clear path to statehood. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction and analysis to MBS's visit to the White House?
Well, this supposed $1 trillion that the Saudis are going to invest, he was very vague about the timeline. Will that be over the next century, over the next 2 or 3 centuries, for example? The impression was left that it'll happen before Mr. Trump's term expires in 2029, I believe it is. But one of the most disturbing aspects of this unfortunate visit was the fact that Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post, sat at the dinner table with MBS, even though MBS, according to the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, was complicit in the execution of a Washington Post journalist, speaking of Jamal Khashoggi, and that in fact, he was chopped up like he was a Thanksgiving turkey and probably deposited in some sort of garbage dump. But not only that, that's obviously a chilling message to other Washington Post journalists who should not necessarily expect support from management if they get into hot water with a foreign regime. But the Saudis allegedly were responsible for releasing on the internet pictures of Jeff Bezos's private parts. And so obviously Jeff Bezos has no shame, which I guess we already knew in the first instance. But also disturbing is the fact that he apparently was able to convince Mr. Trump to get involved in this conflict in Sudan, which we've talked about repeatedly. We've talked about the role of the United Arab Emirates, a neighbor of the Saudis, in financing and arming a faction in this conflict. And this is disturbing because Mr. Trump, although he styles himself as a firefighter, he's actually an arsonist. So if you don't think the situation in Sudan can get worse, stay tuned. Watch carefully the misdeeds of Mr. Trump. And I should also add that it might be a kind of cudgel that the Saudis can use against their rival, the United Arab Emirates, because it would not surprise me at all if they want to steal a march against Abu Dhabi, for example. But I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.